So an interesting anniversary took place this week. If you don't know what the 18th Amendment was, it basically was the amendment that allowed the prohibition of alcohol, which bans the sale, the drinking, as well as the manufacturing and transportation of alcohol throughout the U.S. And to really put into context about how good of an idea prohibition actually was, think back to when you or someone you knew thought it would be a good idea to stick their tongue on a metal pole when it's 12 degrees outside as a kid. Basically, that's how Prohibition turned out. As it was ratified on January 16th of 1919, many people tout this as a very moral victory for the American society, as many felt alcohol was the cause of crime, social debauchery, as well as many people felt it was a public health nuisance, as people just drank alcohol left and right, no matter what time of the day, no matter what time of the night, no matter what they were doing, whether it would be at work, church, just doing a stroll around the park. Pretty much, if anyone could find some reason to drink, they would just drink. The two main groups that spearheaded the Prohibition movement was the Anti-Saloon League as well as the Women's Temperance Movement. These two groups spawned out of now what we call the Third Great Awakening, where many other social issues were pushed with the backdrop of religion. Things such as child labor, as well as the exploitation of women in factories, were issues that were also brought up during this time period. But when we talk about these issues and compare it to Prohibition, there's one main difference in them, and that is the fact Prohibition ended in 1933, and really no one was upset about it because there was a lot of reasons why people hated Prohibition. For one, while the actual sale, manufacturing, as well as transportation of alcohol was outlawed, there was a lot of exceptions to this rule. An example of this was doctors were still able to prescribe alcohol for therapeutic purposes, as well as alcohol was still a big part of the church as it was often used for communion wine. But one key part of the Volstead Act, which was the enforcement and the outline of the policy surrounding the 18th Amendment, was Section 29, which states that 200 gallons of non-intoxicating cider or fruit juice can be made by an industrial farmer. Now, that might sound all fine and dandy back in the day, but to keep in mind, we didn't have phones, we didn't have Twitter, we didn't have social media, extensive cameras to the point where we were able to peek into someone's personal life. Meaning, if a doctor or a preacher wanted to go in the back alley and sell you something on the side without no one noticing, it definitely did take place because during this era, you also had the Roaring Twenties. What's often gets associated with the 20s is speakeasies as well as bootleggers. Bootlegging is the illegal manufacturing and selling of alcohol, and this was rising throughout the 20s. And when you really think about it, there was actually 4Gs to America, which is God, Gold, and Glory, as well as gulping down pipes of beer. Working hand in hand with bootleggers, there was establishments called speakeasy, which were underground bars that oftentimes operated in plain sight because they would usually bribe in law enforcement. Some of the most famous gangsters appeared during this time, especially when you talk about Al Capone. And when you take a deep dive into some of the most famous gangster movies to date, they often are inspired during this time. And to be honest, this wasn't no small feat because while there was up to about 30,000 arrests by 1929, the illegal alcohol industry was worth about $3 billion, which is translated into $40 billion in today's currency. When you think about alcohol being one of the biggest revenue generators for the US government before Prohibition happened, then you will understand why Uncle Sam and many Americans were pressed about this issue. Because as the U.S. government lost about $11 billion in revenue taxes throughout the years of Prohibition, it also cost them $300 million to actually enforce Prohibition. The big question that historians are still trying to figure out today is what was that $300 million used for, and was it effective? When doing the research on the Bureau of Prohibition, which was tasked under the Treasury Department to enact Prohibition, only 4,500 agents throughout the 14 years Prohibition was in effect were actually hired. While that is a jump from the 1,500 agents hired at the beginning, that wasn't nearly enough agents to really cover the entirety of the U.S. And when you have about 22 million American households that you had to keep under your watch, that's about 5,000 households per agent, which is insane. Plus, a lot of these agents weren't getting compensated for their hard work that they have done, and so oftentimes they will fall into the hands of bootleggers. But what is believed to be the biggest nail in the coffin or Prohibition was the Great Depression. Now, there were a lot of sentiments about Prohibition that was taking place during this time. One was that many people felt like Prohibition wasn't really accomplishing what it set off to accomplish, which was to reduce crime. Because when you talk about the massive amount of bootlegging, speakeasies, as well as gang violence, including the St. Valentine's Day's murders that took place in 1929, then you would really think that good Prohibition really gave criminals another outlet to do crimes or to make money. But I think the biggest sentiment that came during this time was that the U.S. was losing a lot of tax revenue that they could have gotten from alcohol. To really put into perspective about this issue, ATF, or the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, estimated that the U.S. got about $365 million in tax revenues in 1917, 2 years before Prohibition was instilled. That is 1/5 of the U.S. tax revenue of that year alone. And when the U.S. lost billions and billions of dollars that is desperately needed during the Great Depression, then you will understand why many people will just be happy to get rid of this amendment. And on the fateful day of December 5th of 1933, the 21st Amendment was enacted into the Constitution, bringing an end to Prohibition. And the legacy of this amendment has many implications on how we look at substance use to today. For example, this amendment allowed states to have more control on the regulation of alcohol and when it's sold, how it's manufactured, and basically what day you can buy it. If you were in Texas a few years ago on a Sunday trying to buy alcohol, you had to wait till afternoon to purchase it because that is a state law. Another implication about the prohibition of alcohol is how do we create policy surrounding substance use when it pertains to marijuana? Because for the longest time, legalization of marijuana has been on the minds of American politicians and the citizens. I can tell you that it doesn't make sense for people to get federal time over ounces and ounces of harmless weed when there's literal child, predators as well as like murderers still out and about in society today. As well as when you compare what happened in the 20s, prohibiting something doesn't really make the world more safe, and it provides another outlet for crime to happen. One heinous crime that has been on the rise for years is creating bad batches where dealers will actually mix, marijuana with other dangerous substances such as fentanyl. And that can cause a lot of issues. And many people are saying that if we can create a nationwide marketplace for marijuana, then we can actually regulate and control what's in marijuana so that way no one can get a bad batch and end up, being unalived. And not to mention, if the government was able to bring tax revenue from marijuana, then we can really fund a lot of different initiatives that we need as a society, such as mental health and health programs, improvements into our education system, create better infrastructure, especially when you talk about roads needing to be paid over and potholes needing to be fixed, and do a slew of other things. This sentiment has seen a lot of promise as many states such as Oregon is starting to do this. But with that being said, if you didn't take anything from this conversation, then leave with this. Just like when you thought as a kid you would be cool to stick your tongue on an ice pole, that was a good idea in theory, but it had terrible end results when it was enacted. But with that being said, if you want to learn more about prohibition as well as the research that went into this video, there's some link down below. Stay warm, stay frosty, depending on what part of the country you're in, and peace out.